When my daughter replied, "If you weren't there for 4 years, don't show up in the last minute," I stared at the screen in silence. I didn't cry. I didn't curse. I just sat there, numb, reading that line over and over again. The words weren't loud. They were final. Clean. Surgical. It was supposed to be a gesture, a bridge, maybe. I had sent a short email offering to help with her student loans. No apologies, no explanations. Just, let me handle part of it, if that's okay. But I guess absence doesn't earn forgiveness. Especially not when it's measured in birthdays, missed, graduation skipped, and holidays spent, pretending not to ache. 2 weeks later, I drained my retirement account, $87,000. I wired it anonymously to her loan provider through a third party. No note, no name, no expectation. I wasn't trying to buy redemption. I just couldn't watch her drown in a debt I helped create by being gone when it mattered most. What happened next was never part of the plan. Because while I thought I was closing the door on our story, something unexpected cracked open. It started with a journal she was never meant to find, and it ended with 5 words I hadn't heard in over a decade. Before you decide whether I deserved what she said, stick with me. This isn't a story about a hero. It's about regret, about silence, about how sometimes love doesn't knock. It waits, quietly, until someone dares to open the door again. My name is Richard Lowell, and I'm 67 years old. I live in a house I built myself. Well, mostly. With calloused hands and stubborn pride, tucked against the edge of a cold Montana ridge. There are no neighbors in sight, just fir trees that bend in the wind like they're trying to tell me something. I retired 10 years ago from a long career in civil engineering. Bridges mostly. Steel, rivets, and concrete. Things that held fast even when everything else fell apart. After the divorce, I didn't take much. Just the truck, my tools, and the house I'd started before things unraveled. Marlene and I had been married for 21 years. She moved to Oregon with our daughter Emily when things finally broke. That was 12 years ago. Since then, my relationship with Emily has been quiet. Not the gentle kind. The other kind. The kind where silence speaks louder than yelling ever could. There's a photo on my mantle of Emily when she was 7, holding a sparkler on the 4th of July, missing a front tooth, laughing at nothing. I haven't seen her in person since she was 15. That was the last Christmas we all spent together. Strained smiles, tight dinners, and an argument over nothing that became everything. After that, it was birthdays, remembered but unacknowledged, cards sent with no reply, and updates about her life arriving secondhand, if at all. I wasn't always like this. Or maybe I was, and I just never knew it. I used to think providing meant presence, that if the checks cleared every month, that was enough. I told myself I was doing my part. I stayed late at work, took every project. When I missed her school play, I sent flowers. When I couldn't make her science fair, I wired money for supplies. Love is sacrifice, I'd say. What I didn't realize is that sacrifice isn't the same thing as absence. My own father was a drunk, mean, angry, and loud. He showed up when he shouldn't, disappeared when you needed him most, and left bruises that weren't always visible. I swore I'd never be like him, and I wasn't. Not in the obvious ways. I never raised a hand to my daughter, never shouted, never drank. But somehow, I still managed to make her feel abandoned. That's the part no one tells you about fatherhood. You can fail just by not being there. When Marlene left, she didn't fight for money. She wanted distance. said Emily needed stability. I gave it to them. Didn't push. Didn't contest custody. I mailed a check every month, paid for health insurance, sent Christmas money, and called on birthdays. Sometimes Emily picked up. Sometimes she didn't. Eventually, the calls stopped. I don't blame her. Kids don't remember who paid the electricity bill. They remember who showed up at their recitals, who tucked them in when they were sick. I built bridges for a living, designed them to hold against hurricanes, earthquakes, even time. But I couldn't hold together the one that mattered most, the one between me and my daughter. Maybe that's the irony. Maybe that's the joke. I still remember the day Marlene told me she was leaving. She stood in the doorway with her arms crossed, bags already packed. "You're more dependable with concrete than with people," she said. I didn't fight, didn't beg. I thought letting her go quietly was the mature thing, the noble thing. It wasn't. It was just easier. It took me years to admit that I was lonely, that the silence in my house wasn't peaceful. It was punishment. I filled it with projects, tinkering in the garage, volunteering to help the town's infrastructure committee. But nothing filled the space she left. And yet, every year, I sent a birthday card. Sometimes I'd write a note. Sometimes I'd just sign my name. Always the same hope. Maybe this year. I know what people think. That fathers like me try to crawl back into their children's lives when the weight of regret finally breaks them. Maybe they're right. Maybe I don't deserve another chance. Maybe I'm too late. But lately, I've started to feel like I'm running out of time. My knees ache in the cold. My memory skips sometimes. I double-check the stove, then check again. I've never been afraid of dying. I'm afraid of dying with things left unsaid, especially to her. After the divorce, I didn't expect open arms, but I hoped for a crack in the wall. A letter, a phone call, something. The first birthday after they moved, I sent Emily a card with $50 and a note in my handwriting. "Proud of you, sweetheart. Love, Dad." I mailed it 2 weeks early, just to be safe. No reply, not even a text. I told myself she was busy, that Marlene had probably misplaced the envelope, that teenagers weren't sentimental. The second year, I sent a necklace. Silver, delicate, something I remembered her admiring at a craft fair when she was 12. Still nothing. So I wrote a letter. Not an email. Not a text. A real letter. Folded in thirds. Sealed with care. I told her I missed her. That I hoped she was doing well in school. That I didn't expect anything. I just wanted her to know I was here. I included my new address, just in case. I didn't hear back. I wrote again the next month. Then again. Eventually, I stopped counting. By the time Emily was 16, I had a drawer full of unsent cards and draft letters. Some of them I'd written twice, once angry, once tender. I never sent the angry ones. I figured she'd heard enough of that tone from me when she was younger, even if I never raised my voice. The silence became routine. Every few months, I'd reach out into the void. A birthday card, a holiday message, a short update about the weather or the dog I rescued. Just fragments, pieces of a conversation I was having alone. Then came her 18th birthday. I didn't know if I should send anything. She was legally an adult now. Maybe she didn't want anything from me. But I sent a letter anyway. This time, I added something different. A request. Her high school graduation was coming up in June. I asked if I could attend. I didn't expect a seat near the front or to be included in any celebration. I just wanted to be there, quiet, in the back, watching her walk across the stage. I got a reply. It came as a text message. No greeting, no pleasantries, just a single sentence that read, "This is my day. I don't want to be uncomfortable." I stared at it for a long time. It wasn't angry. It wasn't cruel. It was worse than that. It was distant, clinical, like a rejection letter from a college I'd never dreamed I could get into. I typed 3 different responses. I understand. I'm sorry. Just know I'm proud of you. I deleted them all. I never wrote back. I didn't go to the graduation, but I found the school's live stream online. I watched it from my living room, alone, in a suit that didn't quite fit anymore. I sat on the edge of the couch, scanning every graduate until I saw her. She looked just like her mother. Same dark hair, same proud posture. But her eyes were mine, sharp, focused, determined. She smiled when her name was called. Not the little girl smile from my mantle photo. This one was tighter, practiced, grown. When she walked across that stage, I clapped, alone in my living room, just me and the sound of a delayed live feed. After the ceremony, I printed a screenshot of her moment. I framed it and placed it beside her childhood photo. A beginning and a bridge I hadn't been allowed to cross. From that day forward, I stopped sending things on birthdays, not because I stopped caring, but because it felt like I was shouting into a canyon and calling it connection. Still, I didn't throw anything away. Every letter I wrote, every card returned to sender, every photo I saved from the internet, I kept them all, boxed in a drawer, labeled with her name. Hope is a strange thing. It shrinks over time, like clothes left in the dryer too long. But somehow, it never disappears. Even when every sign says, "Stay away," a part of me still whispered, maybe one day. Maybe one day she'd read those letters. Maybe one day she'd understand why I didn't fight harder in court. Why I chose silence instead of dragging her through bitterness. Maybe she'd see that I was never absent in love, only in presence. It wasn't enough. But it was what I had. The version of me that Emily grew up with wasn't me. It was a story told by others. By the time she turned 10, that story was no longer open to edits. Her mother and her aunt had written the script, and I had no role but the villain. Marlene came from a family that believed in clean breaks and firm judgments. Her sister, Janice, was the loudest of them all. She never liked me. Not when we were dating, not when we married, and certainly not after we split. I still remember her voice on the courthouse steps the day our divorce finalized. "You gave up the best thing that ever happened to you. Don't come crawling back when you're old and alone." They didn't just cut me out. They rewrote history. According to them, I walked out on Emily. That I chose work over family. That I never really cared. The narrative stuck. Not because it was true, but because I didn't fight it. I didn't call Emily to defend myself. I didn't mail her court documents or bank statements to prove I paid support on time. I didn't send her the long emails I drafted, explaining, clarifying, begging. I never hit send on those because deep down, a part of me believed them. Not their version of events, but their conclusion. That I failed. That I had chances to be more present, and I didn't take them. Maybe I didn't deserve to rewrite the narrative. Maybe silence was my penance. Still, the stories they told hurt. Janice would say things like, "Your dad always thought his time was too important for diapers and homework." Marlene once told me over the phone, Emily doesn't need your guilt trips or your checkbook. She needs stability, and we've got that covered. That word, stability, always landed hard, as if I was chaos incarnate, as if everything I built, every bridge and pay stub and project, meant nothing because I hadn't built it in their image of family. Over the years, I'd hear echoes of their words through Emily's few responses. Once, when I offered to help with her college applications, she replied, "You can't just drop into the picture now that it's convenient." Another time, when I suggested visiting for lunch during a trip near her city, she wrote, "Let's not pretend we're something we're not." She wasn't cruel. She was cautious, like someone who'd been told the stove would burn and refused to touch it no matter how cold the room got. And I was the stove. I tried to understand. I tried to be patient. But there were moments, quiet, bitter moments, where resentment crept in. Not at her, but at the people who drew me with such ugly strokes. I wondered if they ever told her about the nights I stayed up holding her through asthma attacks. The time I drove 6 hours back from a work site to make her third-grade recital, only to arrive sweating, covered in mud, but just in time for her solo. Did they mention how I memorized every song from her favorite movie so we could sing it in the truck together? Of course they didn't. Memories are malleable when repeated often enough. And silence makes a perfect blank page for others to write on. My mistake wasn't in being a bad father. It was in allowing others to tell Emily who I was without offering my own voice. But by the time I realized that, her trust had calcified. The lines were drawn. To her, I wasn't a man who made mistakes and regretted them. I was a man who made choices and never looked back. So I stopped trying to correct the record. Not out of pride, out of resignation. I told myself that if she ever wanted to know the truth, she'd ask. And when she didn't, I convinced myself that silence was her answer. It wasn't fair, but it was reality. And sometimes, accepting the stories people believe about you is the price you pay for not showing up in time to tell your own. It started with an email from someone I hadn't heard from in over a decade. Brian Connolly, an old colleague from my bridge building days. He was one of the few who kept in touch after I retired, mostly through Christmas cards and the occasional forwarded article about new infrastructure projects. This time, though, the subject line read, "Thought you'd want to see this." Inside was a single line, "Is this your daughter?" followed by a LinkedIn link. I stared at it for a few minutes before clicking. It felt intrusive somehow, like peeking into a life I wasn't invited to. But I clicked anyway. There she was, Emily Lowell, 25. Graduate student in education at a university in Portland, passionate about equity in public schools, working to empower students from underserved communities. Beneath that, her job titles: part-time research assistant, evening barista. I read the profile 3 times, each time slower. I took in the tired eyes in her profile photo, the way her smile didn't quite reach her cheeks, the professional tone of her summary, the carefully listed experiences. And then I saw it. One of her public posts, a scholarship fundraiser, trying to close the last $14K gap for this semester, balancing work, study, and dreams. It included a link to a donation page and a brief story about how she'd been paying off student debt herself since undergrad. Curious, I searched further. It didn't take much. A few alumni pages, an article about a tutoring program she volunteered for. And then, tucked in a comment thread, Someone had mentioned how Emily was inspiring, working 2 jobs while carrying almost 90K in student loans. I felt the air leave my lungs. $87,000. It hit me like the echo of a missed call from years ago. All those silent birthdays, all those returned envelopes. And now, this. My daughter was drowning in debt, and I'd spent the last decade measuring my love in cards and guilt. I sat back in my chair, eyes fixed on the screen. In another tab, my bank account flickered open. My savings weren't what they used to be. Retired 10 years. Modest pension. Frugal habits. I'd been careful. Not rich. Not reckless. But careful. I did the math in my head. Paying it all would gut most of my retirement cushion. Not enough to starve, but enough to feel it. A vacation fund gone. Emergency cash erased. Comfort exchanged for discomfort. But what comfort had I earned, really? I printed her profile, her fundraiser, even the donation comment thread. I laid the pages across my kitchen table like a blueprint. My instinctive way of understanding problems. Only this wasn't concrete and load-bearing beams. This was pain. Quiet, invisible pain I hadn't noticed until it was public. I tried to imagine what her daily life looked like. Early mornings behind a coffee counter, afternoons in classrooms, evenings grading papers, weekends probably sacrificed for side gigs, and behind all of it, a silent pressure she didn't share with me because sharing would have required a relationship, and I hadn't earned that. I thought back to when she was a child. Emily once asked me what engineers do. I told her, "We make sure things don't fall down." She laughed and said, "So you're like a superhero for buildings." I nodded and said, "Yeah, something like that." But here she was now, trying to keep herself from falling, and I'd let her carry that weight alone. I opened my checkbook, stared at the blank line, closed it again. I didn't want this to be about money. I didn't want her to think I was trying to buy my way back into her life. But I couldn't sit still. I couldn't just keep reading about her struggles from a safe distance like some stranger who stumbled upon an article. I wrote a short email. No flowery intro. No guilt-soaked confessions. Just this. "Hi, Emily. I came across your fundraiser online. I'd like to help with your student loans, if that's okay. I know I haven't been there. I know this might feel sudden, but I care. I always have. Let me do this small thing." I hovered over send for nearly 10 minutes. Then I clicked. Afterward, I sat back and whispered something I hadn't said out loud in years. I can't change the past, but maybe I can show up for the present. The response came faster than I expected. Barely 3 hours after I hit send, her name flashed in my inbox. I froze. My finger hovered above the mouse, my pulse suddenly louder than the clock ticking in the kitchen. I wasn't ready. Not for gratitude, not for anger, not even for silence, if that was somehow what the email held. I clicked anyway. Her message was only one line. "If you weren't there for 4 years, don't show up in the last minute." No greeting, no name, just words, flat and unadorned, typed in that familiar font every email client uses by default, making it feel even colder. I read it once, then again, and again, until the meaning didn't just land. It settled like a weight behind my ribs. I didn't cry. I didn't throw anything. I just sat there, staring at the screen, with a dull ache growing in my chest. The kind of ache that doesn't ask for attention. It simply stays. That sentence, it didn't scream. It didn't accuse. But it cut. Not with cruelty, but with finality. She wasn't wrong. She had every right to say it. I had been gone. I hadn't called when she moved into her dorm. I didn't visit on her 21st birthday. I didn't know the name of her college roommate, or what kind of coffee she liked, or how many times she'd changed her major. I hadn't earned a place in her crisis. I'd barely earned one in her memories. Still, a part of me had hoped that maybe a simple gesture made quietly might be enough to open a door, not for a parade, not for absolution, just a crack of light. But she had shut it, gently, firmly, and I understood. That night, I didn't eat dinner. I poured myself a glass of water, sat on the porch, and listened to the trees. The wind came through them in waves, like the breath of something older than all my regrets. In the distance, coyotes howled. Somewhere closer, a fox rustled through fallen leaves. Nature doesn't apologize. It just moves forward. Maybe I should have been angry. Maybe some fathers would have written back with a long defense, reminding her of the child support checks, the letters, the cards. Maybe they would have demanded respect. But I didn't feel anger. I felt something quieter, like acceptance or surrender. She had drawn her line. My job now wasn't to step over it. It was to honor it. But honoring it didn't mean disappearing again. I still wanted to help. Not because I expected anything. Not because I believed it would change her mind, but because I was a father. And this was the only way left to act like one. The next morning, I opened a new document. Not an email, a journal. At the top, I wrote the date and the words, "Letter to Emily, not to send." Then I wrote about the message she sent and how I didn't blame her. I wrote about the way her words felt like truth and how I knew they were earned. I wrote about the moment I saw her fundraiser and how proud I was, not just of what she was doing, but of how hard she was doing it. And I kept going. Every day, one entry at a time. Not because I thought she'd ever read them, but because I needed to say the things I never had. Because silence had already cost us too much. Eventually, those entries became a habit, a ritual, like prayer. I wrote in the mornings, with coffee, or at night when the loneliness pressed harder than usual. And all the while, I worked on a new plan. If she didn't want help from me directly, maybe she'd accept it anonymously, quietly, without names or conditions, just relief. I made some calls, contacted a small legal firm that handled anonymous donations and scholarship endowments, asked about how one might go about clearing a student loan without involving the recipient directly. It wasn't simple, but it was possible. I didn't tell anyone, didn't ask for advice, didn't need anyone's approval. This wasn't about me. It wasn't about what I wanted. It was about what she needed, even if she didn't want to take it from me. So I made the arrangements, quietly, carefully. And then I went back to writing, to the empty page, to the voice I had found too late. But still, one I would not let fall silent again. I never planned to spend my retirement like this. For most of my adult life, I'd envisioned something quieter, maybe a little travel, fishing in the summers, woodworking in the winters. I figured I'd build furniture for neighbors, maybe volunteer with local projects. I'd imagined a version of old age where I felt useful, but safe, comfortable. Instead, I found myself sitting in a conference room in Missoula, across from a young lawyer in a gray blazer who looked like he had just graduated law school. "I want to pay off a student loan," I told him, "but I don't want the recipient to know it was me." He raised an eyebrow. Usually, people like credit for that sort of generosity. "I'm not people," I said. He asked a few questions, legal and practical. I answered everything: amount, loan servicer, identifying details I'd gathered from Emily's fundraiser and the public database. I didn't explain who she was. He didn't ask. I appreciated that. The number was clear: $87,000. It would take most of my savings. Not all, but enough that I'd need to cancel any big plans I might have made for the next decade. No road trips, no home renovations, no margin for comfort. Still, when the final document slid across the table and I signed it, I felt lighter. The money transferred a week later through a charitable intermediary account, labeled only as private benefactor, no contact allowed. The firm assured me there would be no paper trail leading back to me. I insisted on that. If this was truly for her, it had to be without strings. I didn't want to be the man who showed up late and expected a hug for it. That same night, I opened a fresh notebook. I wrote the date at the top. Then, Emily, today I signed away most of my retirement. I don't write that to make you feel guilty. I write it because I needed to do something, anything, that felt like love. The kind I never learned how to give when you were younger. That was page 1. The next day, I wrote about the first time she said "daw" instead of dad, and how I never corrected her, because it felt like a nickname only we shared. On page 3, I described her 3rd birthday party, where she smeared chocolate cake into my beard and laughed like she owned the world. Page 4 was about the first time she got sick at school, and I left a meeting to drive an hour and a half, breaking every speed limit along the way. Each page was a memory, a confession, a conversation, a thing I wished I'd said when I had the chance. Sometimes I wrote about the mundane, what I cooked, what the weather was like, the neighbor's new dog. Other times, I wrote things I was afraid to say aloud, that I missed her so much it made my bones ache, that I was scared I'd die before hearing her voice again, that I hated myself for letting distance become our language. I wrote in pen, no edits, no rewrites. Mistakes stayed on the page, the way they did in life. I didn't know what I'd do with the journal. I didn't expect her to read it. Maybe I'd leave it with the lawyer, to be delivered in case I passed away. Maybe I'd burn it one day, as a kind of closure. But for now, it was something real, something living. A record of a father trying, even when it no longer counted. By the end of the month, the pages were stacking up. I bought a second notebook, then a third, each one filled with ink and memory and regret and hope, woven together like threads of a bridge I wasn't sure I'd ever be allowed to cross. I never wrote to be forgiven. I wrote because it was the only way left to be present. Each night, I closed the journal and whispered, "Good night, kiddo," to the empty room. Not because I thought she could hear me, but because, for the first time in years, I believed I was finally saying something that mattered. It wasn't supposed to be anything more than a quiet afternoon. I had driven into the city for an errand, something minor, picking up a part for the generator. The train station was along the way, and I decided to stop for a cup of coffee at the small stand inside. Old habit. I used to enjoy watching the trains, pretending I was going somewhere. That's when I saw her, Emily. She was standing near the far wall, holding a paper cup and a messenger bag that looked far too heavy for her frame. Her hair was tied back messily, her jacket too thin for the wind outside. I almost didn't recognize her. She looked older than 25, tired in a way that had nothing to do with age. I ducked behind a column, unsure of what I was doing. My first instinct was to leave. She didn't want me in her life. I had no right to be near her, but something rooted me in place. I watched her pace, sip her drink, then crouch to adjust her bag. And then she staggered. Her hand reached for the wall, missed it, and she went down hard. My body moved before my brain caught up. I was across the station in seconds, heart pounding, knees slower than they used to be. She was crumpled on the ground, eyes fluttering, face pale. The coffee had spilled, soaking her sleeve. "Emily," I said softly, kneeling beside her. She didn't respond. A nearby man shouted for help. Someone ran to get security. I cradled her head, gently, trying not to panic. Her pulse was there, weak but steady. She was breathing. When the paramedics arrived, I let them take over, stepping back only when I was asked. But I didn't leave. I followed the ambulance to the hospital, stayed in the waiting room, filled out the paperwork under a fake name, James R. I gave my phone number as the local diners and left the address blank. They didn't press. The nurse at the front desk told me she was dehydrated, exhausted, likely hadn't eaten properly in days. Common with overworked grad students, she said. Half a joke, half a diagnosis. I paid the bill in full. Cash. Then I waited outside her room, just down the hall, until a nurse gently told me visiting hours were over. "Are you family?" she asked. "No," I said, "just someone who was there." She tilted her head, studying me, then smiled slightly. "Whoever you are, you got her here in time. She'll be okay." I nodded, unable to speak. Before I left, I asked if someone could tell her, when she woke up, that the man who brought her in was an older gentleman. Just that. No name. She promised she would. I walked out into the night, the cold air slicing against my face like punishment. I didn't get far before I had to sit on a bench just outside the hospital doors. My legs were shaking. Not from age, not from adrenaline, from the overwhelming weight of it all. I had seen her collapse, held her in my arms, saved her life maybe. And still, I couldn't say her name out loud to anyone but myself. It was the closest I had come to touching her world in 10 years, and she would never know. Maybe that was right. Maybe that was fair. But as I sat there, watching taxis roll past and hearing the distant beep of hospital monitors through the walls, I couldn't help but wish, for just 1 second, that I could have stayed long enough to see her eyes open, just long enough to hear her say, "Who are you?" And to answer, quietly, "Just your father." When I got back home, everything felt smaller. The house hadn't changed. The cracked tile in the hallway was still cracked. The old lamp in the corner still flickered when the wind pushed against the windows. But something inside me had shifted, quietly, irreversibly. For years I had chased a ghost, not Emily, but the idea of redemption, the hope that if I did just enough, sent enough cards, wrote enough letters, paid enough debt, I might somehow be allowed back into her life, that she might one day look at me without flinching, that I might hear her call me Dad again, not just in old memories, but sitting in that hospital, watching her unconscious in a room I wasn't allowed to enter. Something cracked open in me. Not sadness, not guilt. Something simpler, something truer. Acceptance. She didn't owe me anything. Not her time, not her trust, not even the knowledge that I'd been the one to carry her into the ER when she collapsed. Love, real love, wasn't transactional. It wasn't a scale that could be balanced with enough good deeds. It was sacrifice without recognition. It was silence without resentment. So I made a decision. No more hoping for thank yous. No more letters expecting a response. No more tracing the edges of our past and wondering when it all went wrong. From that day forward, everything I did for her would be without condition. I called the legal office and authorized the final transfer. Everything I had left in my emergency fund, another $22,000. Combined with what I'd already sent, it would be enough to eliminate the loan completely. Interest, fees, the whole thing. The wire confirmation came through 2 days later. I printed it, folded it into the back of the journal, didn't sign it, didn't even circle the total. Just tucked it between pages like a leaf pressed flat by time. Then I went back to writing, not out of habit, but out of purpose. Every day, I wrote as if I were speaking to her directly. I told her about the weather, the small fox that started showing up near the shed, the smell of snow in the mornings. I told her about the ache in my knees, the song that played in the hardware store that reminded me of when she used to dance in the kitchen. I told her about the dreams, vivid ones, where she was little again, falling asleep on my chest while we watched cartoons I pretended not to like. I no longer imagined the journal as a bridge to reconciliation. It was just presence, a way to be near her in the only way I was allowed. I practiced saying her name out loud every morning. Emily. Not a prayer, not a plea, just a reminder that she existed, that she was real, that she was still mine, even if I wasn't hers anymore. At night, I would place the journal beside the photo of her on my mantle, the one where she's 7, mid-laugh, holding a sparkler. Sometimes, I'd whisper to that photo, "You're okay now. You don't owe me anything." Because that had become my only real wish, that she would live free of the burdens I had helped create, that she would sleep without the weight of debt, without the shadow of my mistakes clinging to her future. I didn't know if I'd ever see her again, didn't know if she'd ever know what I had done, but I did know this. For the first time since she left, I wasn't trying to earn love. I was simply giving it, quietly, completely. And if that meant being forgotten, so be it. Sometimes love means letting go of the hope that it will ever be returned. The first snow arrived early that year. I stood on the porch with a cup of black coffee, watching the flakes drift down like ashes. Quiet, weightless, uninvited. The wind bit through my flannel, but I didn't move. I liked the sting. It reminded me I was still here. Inside, the journals waited. 3 of them now, thick and worn, pages curled at the corners from the oil on my fingers. I'd written every day for 6 months, without fail. Some entries were long, others just a few sentences. But none of them were lies. They weren't for forgiveness anymore. They were a record, a father's private scripture. That week, I had started to feel tired. A kind of deep exhaustion that sleep didn't fix. My hands shook more than usual when I wrote. My breath felt shorter on the stairs. I ignored it. Told myself it was just winter creeping in too fast. But something inside me stirred. A quiet understanding that time was growing shorter. I didn't want Emily to find these pages in a dusty house after I was gone. I didn't want them to be a surprise on a deathbed. That wasn't the point. The point was presence. While she still had a chance to feel it. I called Brian. He answered on the second ring. "Richard," he said, surprised. "You okay?" "I need a favor," I replied, "one that comes with no explanations." There was a pause. "All right," he said slowly. "What do you need?" I explained that I'd packaged 3 journals into a box, sealed it, labeled it simply, "For Emily Lowell." I gave him the address of a post office near the university where she worked. I asked him to hold it until I called again. only to deliver it if I couldn't. You expecting something to happen? He asked gently. No, I said, but I'm done waiting for permission to matter. He didn't push. 2 days later, I drove into town and handed him the box. He held it like it might break. You sure about this? He asked. As sure as I've ever been. I didn't give him the return address. Didn't need her to know where I lived, what I looked like now, how time had worn me down. The words inside the journals were enough. If she wanted to find me, she could. But that choice would be hers, not mine. That night, I wrote the final entry. It took me longer than usual. I sat at the table for nearly an hour before the pen touched paper. Emily, I wrote, this is the last page. Not because I've run out of things to say, but because I've finally said them. All of them. Every word I wish I'd spoken when it mattered. Every memory I feared would vanish with me. I paused, then continued. You don't have to forgive me. You don't even have to read these. But if you've opened this book, if your hands are on this page, it means you've let me exist again, even if just for a moment. I underlined the next sentence. If you're reading this, it means I lived in your memory, even if only for a single day. That was all I'd ever wanted. Not redemption, not repair. Just to be remembered. I signed my name. Not Dad, not Father, just Richard. Because I knew I hadn't earned the others. I closed the journal and wrapped it with the others, placing all three back in the box Brian was now keeping safe. The next morning, I walked through the snow to the post office, not to send anything, but to look at the address I'd chosen. A blue box and a wall of others. Unremarkable, ordinary. And yet, it held the possibility of everything. I stood there longer than I should have, breath fogging in the air, fingers numb. Then I turned and walked home, back to the quiet, back to the ache, but also back to peace. I had said what needed to be said, and now, whatever came next, I could face it without fear. Because even if she never opened the box, even if the journals gathered dust on a shelf, I had finally spoken. And somewhere, just maybe, my voice had found its way back to her. Emily had just come back from her late shift at the cafe when her roommate, Cassie, poked her head out of the kitchen. Hey, weird question, Cassie said, holding a spoon and a tub of ice cream. You get some kind of mystery donation for your student loans? Emily blinked, half exhausted, half annoyed. What? Cassie licked the spoon, then shrugged. One of the pre-law girls I study with interns at the campus legal office. She said some older guy came in last month and paid off a huge loan balance for a student. Didn't want his name on anything. Used some third-party channel. Said it was for someone in the education program. Emily frowned. That could be anyone. Sure, Cassie said. Except she mentioned your name came up. Like, the system flagged your loan as fully satisfied. Out of nowhere. You should check. Emily dropped her bag, suddenly wide awake. She opened her laptop and logged into her loan servicer's portal. It took a moment to load, her fingers tapping the edge of the keyboard. The balance, 0.00. She blinked, refreshed the page. Still $0 Lasser. She scrolled through the payment history. There it was, just over $109,000 total with interest and fees. Paid in full. 2 lump sum payments made weeks apart. No account information listed, no donor name. Cass, she called softly, her voice cracking. It's gone. What's gone? My debt, Emily whispered. She stared at the screen, suddenly cold. For years, that number had hovered over her life like a dark cloud. It was why she worked weekends, skipped vacations, bought secondhand textbooks. Now it was gone. And not because she had paid it off, because someone else had. Her first instinct was confusion. The second, suspicion. She reached out to the university's financial services department, posing as someone trying to confirm who had authorized the final payment. They redirected her to the legal office. A polite assistant there told her the transaction had been initiated by a third-party representative, and no names were available without special clearance. But, the assistant added, I believe the benefactor signed a one-time disclosure under the name James R. The name landed like a drop of water on hot oil. James R. She knew that name. Years ago, when she fainted at the train station, the hospital had told her she was brought in by an older man who gave no last name, just James R. At the time, she had dismissed it as coincidence, a stranger doing a good deed. But now, it all felt too connected. She hung up the phone slowly. Her hands were shaking. James R. She pulled out a shoebox from under her bed, the one she hadn't touched in years. It was full of old birthday cards, most unopened. Some had the return address scribbled off. A few, though, were signed with full names. And one of them, her 18th birthday card, was signed, with love, always, Dad, Richard. Richard. R. She sat down hard on the edge of her bed. For years, she had believed he was gone by choice, that he had chosen silence. But what if? No. No, she told herself. A few checks don't rewrite history. A couple of anonymous gifts don't erase birthdays missed or graduations skipped. But still, the knot in her stomach tightened. Why wouldn't he put his name on it? Why go through lawyers? Why pay off something she had never asked for? She reached for her phone, then stopped. She didn't even know what she would say. Thank you? Why now? You had your chance? None of it felt right. Instead, she sat in silence, the cursor blinking on her laptop beside the $0 balance. It felt like a ghost had just whispered in her ear. For the first time in years, she wasn't sure she hated the sound. The shoebox still sat open on Emily's bed when she spotted the package in the corner of her closet. She had almost forgotten about it. An envelope-sized box that had arrived weeks earlier, misdelivered to her old student mailbox at the campus union. No return address, just a handwritten label, for E only. At the time, she'd assumed it was from a former classmate or a program coordinator. She tossed it aside, meaning to deal with it later. Now, something told her to open it. She pulled it down, fingers suddenly trembling, and peeled back the tape. Inside, wrapped in a faded flannel cloth, was a thick, cloth-bound journal, not new. The cover was worn, the edges of the pages slightly yellowed. On the first page, in neat, deliberate handwriting, it read, "For Emily, no one else." She sat on the floor, the journal resting in her lap like something sacred. She hesitated, then turned the page. Emily, if you're reading this, then maybe, just maybe, I've found a way to speak when I couldn't before. Her eyes locked on the words. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but unmistakably masculine, measured, thoughtful, with the occasional shaky stroke that made her picture aging fingers gripping the pen. I don't expect you to finish this. I don't expect you to forgive. But I needed you to know the truth, not the version told by time, or silence, or anger. Just my truth. She turned another page, and another. Each one was a letter, a memory, a confession. The voice on the page didn't try to defend itself. It didn't argue or rewrite the past. It simply remembered. The stories were vivid. Her third birthday party, the way she danced barefoot on the back porch, how she once drew a picture of a bridge and said, "Just like the ones Daddy builds." She hadn't remembered that, but now she could see it. Herself in crayon, the drawing crooked, the smile on her father's face as he taped it to the fridge. He described the day she was born, the weight of her in his arms, the way he had whispered her name over and over, trying to memorize it before the world rushed in. He didn't excuse the silence. He admitted to fear, to pride, to shame. He described the divorce not as a moment, but a slow erosion he didn't fight hard enough against. He wrote about standing outside her graduation, watching from the parking lot, because she had asked him not to come. "I didn't want to make your day harder," he wrote. "So I sat in the truck and watched through the window. I clapped when you crossed the stage. I cried when no one saw." She kept reading. He wrote about the hospital, the train station, the moment she fainted and he carried her in his arms like when she was a child, the fake name he gave, the receipt he paid in cash, the way he left before she woke, because he thought she wouldn't want to see him. Emily's hand covered her mouth. The pages blurred with tears she didn't know were coming. She read the financial disclosures, the exact amounts paid to her loan accounts, down to the cent. She saw the email drafts he never sent, the apology he never spoke out loud. And then, toward the end, she found a different kind of entry, a prayer, not to God, but to her. "Emily, today it snowed, and I imagined you walking across campus in that too thin coat. I wish I'd been the one to remind you to wear something warmer. I wish I still had the right." She read for hours. The words pulled her through time, memory, and grief like a thread. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. It was gentle, steady, like a heartbeat she had forgotten she used to listen to. By sunrise, she had reached the last page. "If you're reading this, it means I lived in your memory, even if only for a single day." There was no signature, just white space, and a single tear stain, long dried. Emily sat on the floor, the journal pressed to her chest, and sobbed. Not for what was written, but for everything that never had been. The years lost, the words unsaid, the questions she never asked, because she thought she already knew the answers. But most of all, she cried because for the first time, she wasn't sure she hated him. The light in Emily's room had shifted by the time she turned the last page. Morning crept in through the blinds, casting soft stripes across the carpet, the bed, and the open journal in her lap. Her eyes burned. Her body ached from sitting in one spot all night, but she didn't move. She couldn't. The final sentence still echoed inside her, heavy and irreversible. "I don't need you to forgive me. I only need you to live unburdened." That line unraveled something in her, something tightly wound and carefully guarded for over a decade, a resentment she had worn like armor, a story she had told herself over and over, that he didn't care, that he had left, that he had never looked back. Now, that story lay in pieces around her. She stood slowly and walked to her desk. The journal felt heavier now in her hands, as if its weight had grown with each page. She set it down carefully and unfolded the flap at the back cover, where a few loose documents had been tucked. The first was a photograph. She recognized the angle immediately. It was from her high school graduation. She was mid-step, walking across the stage, her head turned just slightly to the left. The picture had been taken from far away through a window. The glass reflected light in a way that partially obscured her face, but the pride in her posture was unmistakable. She had no idea anyone had captured that moment, but someone had. He had. The next item was a hospital invoice, paid in full, dated the day she had fainted at the train station. The listed patient, Emily Lowell. The name of the person who signed the release, James R. Her hand trembled as she reached for the last item, a receipt from the loan servicer, showing the final balance cleared. The signature space was blank, but the amount matched exactly what she had seen in her portal. No notes. No from Dad. Just evidence. Proof of everything she never knew he had done. She sat down again, slowly, as if moving too fast might break whatever fragile truth had just settled inside her. He had been there. Not loudly. Not the way she had always wished. But he had been present. In quiet, impossible ways that she hadn't seen because she hadn't been willing to look. Her father had watched her graduation from the parking lot. He had carried her into the ER and left before she woke up. He had erased her debt without signing his name. And then he had written, not to be redeemed, but simply to be remembered. She thought of all the years she had deleted his emails without opening them. The birthday cards she'd tossed in the trash unopened. The times Cassie had mentioned seeing someone who looked familiar near campus, and she had rolled her eyes. Had it been him? Had he been watching from the sidelines all along, hoping for 1 second of eye contact, 1 second of connection? She pulled the journal back into her lap, flipping again to that final page. If you're reading this, it means I lived in your memory, even if only for a single day. Her vision blurred again. It wasn't the grand gesture that broke her. It wasn't the money or the journal or the proof. It was the humility. The heartbreaking simplicity of a man who asked for nothing except that she might breathe easier. He hadn't tried to rewrite history. He had only asked for her freedom, and he had paid for it in silence. The sob came fast this time, full-bodied, raw. She folded forward, the journal cradled in her arms like a child. Her tears soaked into the fabric of the cover, into the pages he had touched, into the ink he had pressed down, letter by letter. For the first time, she saw her father not as the man who left, but as the man who had stayed in the only ways he knew how. She had judged him through the lens of a child abandoned. Now, for the first time, she saw him through the eyes of a daughter he had never stopped trying to love. And in that moment, surrounded by daylight and memories and years too long gone, Emily did something she never thought she would. She whispered, "I miss you." And this time, she meant it. The message came just before noon. Richard was sitting on the porch, a half-finished crossword on his lap, when his phone buzzed beside him. He didn't get many texts, mostly reminders from the pharmacy, occasionally a weather alert. He picked it up expecting the usual. Instead, he saw her name, Emily. For a moment, he didn't breathe. The text was short. "If you're still around, maybe dinner tomorrow?" No punctuation beyond the ellipsis, no context. But it didn't matter. It was her, reaching out. He reread it 5 times, then once more, just to be sure it hadn't disappeared. He didn't reply right away, not out of pride or strategy, just caution, like someone staring at a flame, afraid even a breath might snuff it out. Then he typed back, "Tomorrow works." That night, he laid out his clothes like he used to before early construction shifts, a pressed button-down, the leather belt he hadn't worn in years, shoes he polished by hand. He even trimmed his beard and took a razor to the edges. careful to avoid the thinning patches. It had been a long time since he'd cared about how he looked. But this felt different. The next evening, he drove to the address she sent. A quiet diner near her campus, not too crowded, not too loud, familiar in its ordinariness. He arrived early and sat in the parking lot for 10 minutes, watching the door. At exactly 6 o'clock, she walked in. He followed a few moments later. Emily was already seated in a booth by the window, her hands folded on the table. She looked up when he approached, and for a brief second, their eyes met. She didn't smile. Neither did he. But she nodded, and he sat down. The waitress came. They ordered simple things: grilled cheese, tomato soup, black coffee, comfort food, stripped of pretense. Neither of them talked while they waited. The silence wasn't tense. It wasn't warm either. It was neutral, careful. When the food arrived, they ate. Still, no words. But in the clinking of silverware, in the passing of salt, in the unspoken understanding of this shared, fragile space, there was something almost sacred. Halfway through the meal, Emily looked up. "You really carried me?" she asked softly. Richard set his spoon down. "Yes," he said. She nodded, eyes dropping back to her plate. "And the loans?" He didn't answer. He didn't have to. She already knew. They ate the rest of the meal in silence. When the check came, she reached for her wallet. He gently placed his hand over hers. "I got it," he said. She let him. Outside, the sky had darkened, and the air smelled of rain. They stood beside her car for a long moment, unsure of the script, unsure if there even was one. Emily shifted her weight. Her voice was barely audible. "Thank you. For the journal." He nodded once. Then, without warning, she stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him. Not tightly, not urgently, but long enough for him to close his eyes and press his cheek to her hair. Long enough for the years to fall away, at least for a moment. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. When she pulled back, her eyes were wet. "So, tomorrow?" she asked. "Same time?" Richard smiled. "Just a little." "Yeah, same time." As he walked back to his truck, he felt something settle inside him. Not closure, not even peace, but presence. For the first time in years, he wasn't a ghost orbiting the edges of his daughter's life. He was her father. Not perfect, not forgiven, but present. The letter arrived 3 days after their dinner. It came in a plain white envelope tucked between junk mail and a utility bill. No return address, just his name written in careful cursive across the front. Richard stood on the porch, holding it like it might vanish. The handwriting was unfamiliar and familiar all at once. Older now, steadier than the crooked notes she used to scrawl on birthday cards long ago. But something in the shape of the letters still carried the echo of childhood. He sat down at the kitchen table, tore the envelope open, and unfolded the page inside. It began simply, "Dad." He paused there. Let the word sit for a moment. The sound of it, even in silent reading, filled the room. "I've read the journal twice now. I don't think I'm done reading it. Every page opens something I'd locked away for so long, I forgot it was even mine to carry. I don't know if I'm ready to forgive. That word feels too big, too final. But I do know this. I want to try knowing you again. Not the version I grew up hearing about, not the ghost I built in your absence. I want to meet the man who wrote those pages, the one who showed up in silence, who carried me without being seen, the one who loved without needing to be right. I think he's worth knowing. and I think I might be ready to let him in. Maybe not all at once, but maybe dinner again, maybe coffee, maybe a walk. We'll see. The letter ended with one more line, scribbled hastily in the margin, as if she'd almost forgotten to write it. P.S. I kept the journals, all of them. Richard let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. His hand rested on the paper, the corners slightly curling in the afternoon warmth. Outside, the wind rustled the pine trees. A dog barked in the distance. Somewhere nearby, life moved forward. He folded the letter gently and walked to the mantel. There, beside the photo of Emily, holding a sparkler at 7, he placed it upright, next to a newer picture he had printed the day before. The two of them sitting across from each other at the diner, heads tilted forward, plates between them, untouched, both smiling just slightly, not for the camera, for each other. He sat back down and stared at that image, and then at the letter. And for the first time in decades, Richard Lowell smiled. Not the polite smile he wore for strangers, or the tight-lipped one he used for neighbors in passing. This was something softer, something real. It was the same smile captured in an old photo from when Emily was 3, arms wrapped around his neck, her face buried in his shoulder. He had no idea back then how hard the years would be. But right now, he knew this much. He was her father again, and that was enough.